impact of time. You only have to look this way to get an idea of the impact of time. And I only have to look this way to see many examples of the impact of time. Yesterday, today, forever, Yeshua is the same. All may change, but Yeshua never. Glory to his name. Don't sing it. See, you were all about to join in, weren't you? No? Okay. You mean it's only the oldies that know that song? Put your hands up if you know that song. Yesterday, today, forever, Yeshua is... All right. Put your hands up if you've ever read the scripture that song comes from, that talks about Yeshua being the same yesterday, today, and forever. And aren't you glad that Yeshua doesn't change over time? But Yeshua may not change, but the world changes. I change, you change. Everything around us changes. Culture changes, languages change. Even if it's the same, called the same name, it changes. We don't speak like Shakespeare did. Things change. Technology changes. Look. Technology changes. Knowledge changes. Knowledge increases. We don't think now. We don't understand now like we don't understand like Einstein understood. We don't understand like Newton understood. And we think they were great men. But things have changed. Things have moved on. The world has changed. Is that right? 2,000 years ago, they were in a different world. Well, but Yeshua never changes. And today I'm looking at a church that has changed. The congregation of Yahweh has changed. And if we go back 2,000 years, as we heard when John and Esther and others were talking about, we know that things have changed. And yet they were talking about getting back to some of the things. Were you saying something like that? I'm looking at Esther and she's... I've got to look at John. I don't know. Where is John? Oh, he's over there. Okay, there's something that we have to get back to. Okay. But things have changed. And today, I'm going to be looking at how the church has changed over 2,000 years. And I better first of all explain what I mean when I say the church. We have had people tell us that church, the Greek word ecclesia, is a term that refers to people. Is that right? It refers to the people of Yahweh. It refers to you and me, the people that have given their lives to Yeshua, his body. That's what the word church is used. That's the real meaning of the word church. But we are also being told that most people, when they hear the word church, they think of a building, or maybe they think of an organization, a religious organization. There's all sorts of different ways that we can interpret the word church nowadays. And I'm going to be using the word church quite frequently today. And I had great difficulty. I was thinking, well, will they know what I'm talking about? Well, that's a question to ask before any sermon, isn't it? And so I decided I'm leaving it up to you. I am not going to tell you what I mean when I say use the word church. I'm hoping that the context that I use it in will tell you which of those. Am I talking about an organization? Am I talking about a building? Am I talking about the body of Yeshua? I'm hoping it will be obvious, but I'm not going to stop and change. I'm just going to use the word church in every different meaning. So if you're not sure, well, you can always put your hand up and do that anytime, and I'll either ignore it or... No, I will try and tell you what I mean. Impact of time, what has changed when we are thinking about the church? And the first thing, I'm going to take various aspects of the church, different things about the church, and very briefly just go through how they have changed. I'm thankful that already some of the things that I'm going to say have been said in previous sermons. David Pawson said some things last night. Esther said some things. John said some things. I think others have said some things. So I'm going to try not to overlap too much. In other words, I can move on quickly because it's already been said. But if I think you might have forgotten, I might say it again. The first thing I want to look at is where it meets. Now, we know from what John and Esme told us that in Jerusalem, just after Yeshua ascended, the church was meeting in houses. This is a model of some of the houses in Jerusalem. That's where the church was meeting. And we also heard that frequently, they would go to the temple and they would worship in the temple. And we heard about them going to the, colonnade of Solomon's colonnade. And okay, that's what they were doing in Jerusalem. Of course, 40 years after the temple was destroyed, the Romans destroyed most of the city and destroyed the temple. So they weren't able, from the year 70 onwards, they were not able to go to the temple, but they were still meeting in houses. And we heard that Paul used to go to the synagogues, and he would preach the gospel there until he realized that he wasn't getting anywhere in the synagogues, and so they started they moved into houses. And we heard how Paul, whichever you want, hired a room in Ephesus, and for 2 years he used to teach in that room every afternoon. And so that's what we've heard. But obviously we've heard that the congregation was growing, that people were being added daily to the church, and therefore congregations were getting bigger. And I don't know what your house is like, but there is a limit to how many people you can get in our front room. And the same thing would have been happening back here. I don't know how big these houses were. This is just one type of house that was there. But things would get difficult after a while. And maybe because it was a fairly hot country, they could expand outside the house, but eventually they would have to do something about that. And what did they do? Well, they either started another church in another house. They could meet in as many houses as they liked. But of course, what did the congregation of Yahweh do when we had covenant houses and we had a lot of people? What did we do? We knocked down walls and we made small rooms into big rooms. And that's exactly what they did. And we have examples of that. What the earliest example we have of that is from the year 250, a house in Syria, which has obviously been modified in order to accommodate a church, a group of people worshipping Yahweh. They'd knocked two walls into one, and I think from what was on the walls and what was in that room, they can tell that it was being used as a church. See, using church in a different form, with a different meaning there. It wasn't long that when the early church started being persecuted, from the time of Stephen, wasn't it? And we heard last night how Nero wasn't very nice to the church. He, as David Pawson told us, he was accused of burning Rome down, and so he needed somebody, a scapegoat. And so he used the Jews. Sorry, not the Jews this time. That was lots of other times, but he used the Christians as his scapegoat. And during the 3 centuries, the first 3 centuries that the church was in existence, they were sporadically persecuted. Not always in every place all the time, but at different times in different places. And the Emperor Tacitus wrote this.
To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace.
He didn't like them. And Emperor Trajan said,
The name of Christian alone was sufficient grounds for punishment, and Christians were not to be sought out by the government.
okay, you can see the sorts of attitudes that some of the emperors had towards Christians, and that's why they were sporadically being persecuted. In the year 250, Decius was the emperor, and he went even further. He proclaimed an empire-wide edict against the Christians. Throughout the Roman Empire, which by that time was very big, he said that Christians were not allowed to be Christians. And that's when we get all these stories of them being taken into the arena and pulled apart by lions, and all sorts of persecution was happening there towards the Christians. So what did that do to the Christians? Well, maybe from what we heard last night, they started expanding. Persecution can have that effect, can't it? Maybe they went underground. You've heard of the underground church? Okay, when well, in fact, in Rome, they did literally go underground. Because in Rome, they had built burial chambers under the ground in what they called the catacombs. And Christians went and worshipped under the ground in the catacombs. Okay, in the graveyard, shall we say. And it wasn't until the reign of the Emperor Constantine that this stopped. Persecution of Christians. When Constantine became emperor, we got a picture of him. Not a photograph. But that's Emperor Constantine. And you know what happened to the Emperor Constantine? He was a pagan. He was a sun worshipper. He worshipped all the gods that the Romans were worshipping. You've heard of all the Roman gods, haven't you? There are loads of them. And of course, before that, you had the Greek gods. And they were worshipping many different gods. And Constantine was one of those until he heard the gospel. And he, it is said, was converted. And he made sure that the Christians were not persecuted anymore. A lot of people have a lot of bad things to say about Constantine, but I think he did some pretty good things as well. Maybe that was one of them. He stopped the persecution. He went even further than that, and he made Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. In other words, throughout the Roman Empire, the official religion, before they went into battle, they would pray to the Christian God. And that was great. And many people became converted during that time. Now, these people that were being converted were, of course, originally pagan worshippers. They worshipped the sun and the moon and the other gods. And so the numbers of people in the church obviously increased. And we get the same situation again. I don't know how many house fellowship or catacomb fellowships or underground churches there were, but when they were able to come up and they were able to worship freely, you can imagine that they would need bigger places to worship in. And so we find that they began to hire halls. Some of the halls that were originally used for pagan worship, they were able to hire them and worship Yeshua there. They built churches, they built buildings in which to worship. And from the 4th century, we get a sudden increase in the number of churches that were being built. Remember a lot of these converts were originally from pagan religions. Okay? And what did the pagan religions have in abundance? Temples. Vast temples. Here's just 3 of them. We've got the temple of Hephaestus in Athens, the temple of Neptune, and another temple that I haven't got a name for. But these were all around them. So can you imagine Christians having been converted and seeing all these great temples around, and once they became Christians, what do you think many of them wanted to do? They wanted to compete, because in their mind, the bigger your temple, the greater your God. And so obviously the Christians too would want their temples, would want their big buildings. And so we get bigger and bigger buildings being built to compete with the pagan religions, maybe. Sometimes more that than to fit more people in. Maybe there weren't that many people, but they wanted a big building so that they can say, we've got a big God, because we've got a big building. And so through the years, these churches were being built, and by the time we get to the Middle Ages, the 12th century, 13th century, we're getting big meeting places. They called them cathedrals. The cathedrals were great. The bigger they were, the higher they were, the taller the spire reaching to heaven, or whatever. They were being built very much so during the Middle Ages, the 12th, 13th century. And that has continued. Great cathedrals have been built and still being built today. I think Liverpool Cathedral was only finished 10 or 20 years ago. I'm not even sure it's still finished. You go to Barcelona and look. Have you seen the Barcelona Cathedral with its spires? Magnificent building. I don't know when they started it. It was many years ago, but they are still building it today. They still want to reach heaven. Maybe. And these buildings would have been decorated with images of Yeshua on the cross, maybe the cross itself, the apostles around the Barcelona Cathedral. They've got the apostles, have you seen them? Some weird things. And also the saints. Saints. What do we mean by saints? Originally, saints was a word that meant holy ones. It meant those people that had given their lives to Yeshua. We are saints. Back there, the church was made up of saints. But gradually, the word saint began to refer to just certain individuals. Individuals that had done great things. Individuals that had performed miracles. They were made saints. Usually after they were dead, they were made saints. And things were put up, pictures of them were put up, and some people even began to worship them. In fact, it came to the place. I say, actually, this was quite early on in the 2nd century. They were beginning to take bones of eminent people that had died, and they were putting them into little boxes and they were worshipping them. Reliquaries. That's a skull and reliquary of St. Ivo of Kenmartin in Tregear, Brittany, France. I don't know whether you can see it, but there's a skull in there. Isn't that wonderful? Everybody wants a skull in their church, don't they? And this one, look, they've actually got a bit of the true cross that Yeshua was crucified on, just a little bit of it, because you can go to many churches and find out. If you go to all the churches, collect all the bits, I doubt if they would build a cross. But this was the sort of thing that they were beginning to do. Was this what worship was all about? In the beginning, Yeshua was central. In the beginning, they worshipped Yeshua. They worshipped Yahweh. But gradually, these things began to take over. They began to think that they could even pray to the saints, and that the saints would somehow be able to go to Yahweh and say, this is a good chap down here. But what are we told? Who is the mediator? Who is the one between man and Yahweh? It is Yeshua and nobody else. But that is something that happened. And that was part of their work. But don't think that the whole church was like this. There were many people who were doing exactly what they should have been doing. They were worshipping Yeshua, they were worshipping Yahweh, and they were doing it well. And I've got a quotation here from Justin Martyr. He was one of what is commonly called the Church Fathers. He was actually martyred in the year 165, and he wrote this about a church service.
On the day called Sunday, there is a gathering together in the same place of all who live in a given city or rural district. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader ceases, the president, in a discourse, admonishes and urges the imitation of these good things. Next, we all rise together and send up prayers. When we cease from our prayer, bread is presented, and wine and water. The president, in the same manner, sends up prayers and thanksgiving, according to his ability, and the people sing out their assent, saying the Amen. A distribution and participation of the elements for which thanks have been given is made to each person, and to those who are not present, they are sent by the deacons. Those who have means and are willing, each according to his own choice, gives what he wills. And what is collected is deposited with the president. He provides for the widows and the orphans, those who are in need on account of sickness or some other cause, those who are in bonds, strangers who are sojourning. And, in a word, he becomes the protector of all who are in need.
It would seem from that, he says, we meet together on a Sunday, it would seem that they'd already moved over to keeping Sunday, and everybody was keeping Sunday. But I've got another quote here from Scholasticus, somebody or other, Socrates Scholasticus, in the 5th century, he wrote this.
For although almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week, yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this.
That would seem to suggest that outside of Alexandria and Rome, they were still keeping the Sabbath. They were still meeting together on the Sabbath. And I'm sure that there were many churches that were doing that. And so what have we got here? Okay, they met together. Does that sound familiar? That description of a church service. What have we got in it? We've got, really, I think we've got what we'd expect to see today. We've got, sorry about that. We've got a Bible reading. Yeah, have that today. Then we've got somebody expounding and a sermon, teaching, apostles' doctrine. Then we have prayer. Then we have breaking of bread, and notice that it was bread and wine and water. They watered the wine down, I think, to make sure that things that were happening in Corinth didn't happen here. But they had the breaking of bread, and then it says they had a song, and finally they had an offering for all those that could give to help all those that didn't have. That's more or less what we do today. I mean, okay, it may have been fairly different. For example, the song, all we hear that it was a refrain, it was a response. I don't know whether it was more like chanting. I don't know. But that's one of the things that's changed over the years. Music has changed so much. From that simple response, people began to write hymns and sing hymns. And other people later on began to write great musical works around the story of Yeshua and the Bible, Handel's Messiah and things like that. Others converted popular secular music, giving them words that were sacred. And, well, that's what happened. And today's worship, the trouble is that today we often equate worship with music, don't we? Worship, we have a worship slot. The worship slot starts when we walk in and finishes when we walk out. We all agree with that, don't we? Yeah. Okay, we use words because really there's no other way of describing things, but we know that worship is what we give to Yahweh. And it can come in the form of music, it can come in the form of prayer, it can come in so many different forms. So that's the sort of thing that was happening when was that, year 150. So fairly early on, things were working like that. Now let's look at the leadership of the church. Yeshua, we heard, trained his apostles. For 3.5 years, his apostles, his disciples worked with him. And he set them examples. And they gave their lives to learn from their master, from their rabbi, from Yeshua. And when he sent them out, when he sent the 70 out, he called them apostles, messengers. And they went out to take the message. And when Yeshua ascended and the church was left in Jerusalem, those apostles began to teach the word of Yahweh. And others were added to the church, notably Paul, who hadn't actually been there with Yeshua, but they were added to the church, the apostles. And as the church moved out from Jerusalem, so we read that the apostles put in place elders, people that were respected by the churches, or by the people in the churches, whatever you want to say. There's three words, two words in Greek that are used to describe these people, episkopos and presbyteros. These are words that really they mean overseers. And the Latin word is, if I can find it, the Latin word is biskupos, from which, of course, we get our word bishop. And in some translations, those words are actually translated as bishop. So we've got elders, overseers, bishops. It's same sort of thing. People that were put in place because they were seen, they were respected by the people, and they were able to work with the people. And Paul said to Timothy,
"The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, He desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for Yahweh's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain," and the laborer deserves his wage.
So these were the leaders of the congregations of Yahweh, the groups of people that were working together to serve Yeshua. These men were to oversee the flock, to shepherd his people, to protect them from enemies, to teach and exhort them, to encourage them. And he was to do this primarily through example. That was the important thing. And that's why Paul had to write to Timothy about all those characteristics that were necessary if you were going to be a leader, an elder, an overseer in the church. And it says that he has to do it willingly, with an eager spirit, not by coercion or for financial gain. And so we get these people, these elders, and elders literally means older people, but not necessarily older in age, but people that were respected by the church. As you get older, hopefully, you earn respect. Is that right? Respect is something you earn, isn't it? And these leaders earned their respect, and the people followed them and their teachings. But in time, we find that we now get into an area where there are professional leaders. People that have been trained to lead. Nothing wrong with being trained to lead. Of course, we need trained leaders. But perhaps the main issue is that they became what I'm going to call monarchical leaders. You know what monarchical means? Mono is one. Anyway, one leader. So the church would have one person who was in charge. And I think, just one moment, I think I've got... Yes, we have Jerome, who was another of the church leaders. And this is what he said.
The supremacy of a single bishop arose by custom rather than by the Lord's actual appointment as a means of preventing schisms in the church.
Now, the things that happened in the church, they weren't strange things. I mean, if you've got, elders is always used in the plural. The church was governed not by an elder, but by elders. When Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem for the council there, because there was a problem that they needed to sort out, it says they went to James, who seemed to be one of the main leaders in Jerusalem, but it says James and the elders. It seems that there was never one person. It was a group of people. Now, if you've got a group of people in leadership, what is going to happen? dissension. They are going to disagree occasionally. Is that not right? And so no doubt that's why Jerome says it came about by custom rather than by a command as a means of preventing schisms in the church. And you can imagine how that was taken on. More and more, the great one person making the decisions means you're not going to have schisms. Everybody's going to do what they say. And of course, that ended up with having somebody like the Pope, who eventually came to a place where it was said that he was infallible. I was amazed that that didn't actually happen until the 19th century. Did you realise that the Pope wasn't infallible? It was an edict of something or other in 18-something when the Pope was finally said to be infallible. And I think that's disappearing a bit now because popes are getting a bit awkward, doing strange things. But that is what is happening. Now today, those leaders might be called pastors, vicars, elders, bishops. We've got all sorts of names for them. But very often it is one person, even today, isn't it, that is in control of a congregation. And so the church developed. So we've got monarchical leadership coming about because of this. And then the church was developed in the Roman Empire. And the hierarchical structure of the Roman Empire worked really well. Each city or each town would have its leader. And the bigger the town, or the bigger the city, the more respect that leader would have. And that's how the Roman Empire was governed. And of course, the biggest city of all was Rome or Constantinople. They were the two biggest cities. And so the person in charge in Rome eventually became the emperor, became the one in charge of everything else. So the bigger your city, the more responsibility you had, the more respect you had, the higher you were in the hierarchy. And it seemed to work very well. Constantinople was also, the Roman Empire eventually split into two, east and west, and the leader in Constantinople eventually became the sort of Eastern emperor. And the emperor used to fight against one another, and so you get people in charge of one city fighting against another. And that same situation, because it worked so well, the church was part of that situation, so we find that the church began to develop along the same lines. It was efficient, and particularly after the 4th century, after Constantine said that Christianity was the official religion, it really took off. Because now you've got the church leaders and you've got the secular leaders. Well, if you've got a choice, who are you going to want in charge? Probably the secular ones, I know. But it gradually developed that the church leaders became the secular leaders. And there was a chap called Leo who was instrumental in delivering Rome. I'm trying to find who delivered him from. Attila the Hun. You all heard of Attila the Hun? He came down from the north with his army and he attacked the mighty Roman Empire. He went to Rome. And if it hadn't been for Leo leading the Roman army, Attila the Hun would have destroyed Rome and the Roman Empire would have collapsed completely. As it was, it went on for a bit longer. And Leo became the leader. And they began to call him Papa, Father, or today, Pope. He was the one of the great leaders. He did a wonderful job for Rome, but he was also trying to lead the church, trying to be a shepherd to the church. And in the 6th century, we've got Gregory, who also became a great leader in the Roman Empire. The eastern part of the empire was a bit different. It didn't collapse quite like the leadership of the western part was collapsing. And so in Constantinople and all the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church that we know of today, it's not actually allowed for a church minister to be a secular leader. Although they did relax that occasionally, but that is the case in the Eastern Church. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, the 10th, 11th, 12th century, the church is wielding great power. The Roman Catholic Church we're talking about now, aren't we? The church that is very much centered on the Pope in Rome. And then we move on to the Reformation, when, of course, we've already heard about Henry the Great, haven't we? Who said Henry the Great? Was it you? No, Henry VIII. Somebody said Henry the Great. We've heard about Henry VIII, who... Oh, was it you, Nate? Shucks. Okay, Henry VIII, who obviously he wanted to marry and divorce and chop his wife's heads off and things like that. And so he of course, moved away from the Roman Church, and we get the Church of England. And as Nathan was telling us, there was a lot of other reasons involved in that. But in Europe, the Reformation happened, and the Roman Church was no longer the supreme authority in many countries, was still in some. And but even these churches, these reformed churches, like the Church of England, they had to have a leadership structure. And so we find, if you look at the Church of England today, I'm not criticising this, there has to be a structure. But in that Church of England, what have you got? You've got archbishops, bishops, vicars, rectors, priests, curates, all with different responsibilities. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's the same sort of hierarchical leadership that came all the way through from Rome. And of course, in other churches, you may have pastors, you may have bishops, you may have elders, all sorts of different forms of leadership, all of which depend on the tradition of the church. The Church of England has their tradition. The Congregation of Yahweh have their tradition. Every church has its tradition. Now tradition, let's move on to tradition, because tradition is an important thing. Yeshua had a lot to say about the tradition of the Pharisees, didn't he? He did not like it. And he spoke against it. What was he speaking against? Well, this is what I think tradition, the problem with tradition. Tradition in itself is not wrong. The Jewish people had wonderful traditions. The Pharisees had wonderful traditions, but Yeshua spoke against some of them, because tradition becomes wrong when it distracts from or becomes more important than Scripture. I'm talking about the people that believe in the Scripture now. Is that right? And any repetitive action, okay, because that's what traditions are, aren't they? They're repetitive actions. Any repetitive action becomes wrong when it loses its meaning or takes on an alternative meaning. So tradition itself is not wrong. And of course, as the church developed, it developed its own traditions. They had the traditions of the Jewish people. Of course they did, because that's who they were. They had the traditions going back to Adam. They had the feasts. They had all those traditions. But the Christian church then began to develop its own tradition. And in doing so very much, I won't say very much. In doing so, sometimes forgot the traditions from back there. We call them Old Testament traditions, but I don't think that's a good way to describe them. The traditions that Yahweh has put in place. But the church developed traditions. And of course, as I say, that is not a bad thing. But this is, what can we take as an example of a tradition? Breaking of bread. Is that a tradition? It's a tradition that Yeshua said, do this. Yeah? And he said, do it. And they began to do it when they were having meals together. They were doing what was a tradition. Have you got something to say about this? No, I must have then. Okay, I've got a quote here. I don't know who it's from. It says, what was a shared life experience during a meal became an empty ritual. And you can look at the breaking of bread in many churches today, and what is it? It is an empty ritual. I am sure that some of the people doing that every week, breaking bread, taking the wafer, I'm sure a lot of people are doing it with a right heart. But for many, it's a tradition. It's just something we do. I pray that that never happens here. Of course, there is one way around that. Don't do it. That's a bit silly, isn't it? Yes, we have to do it. And it becomes, in a sense, a tradition. But we have to remember, it was a life-shared experience in the beginning. It was only because, was it in Corinth, they were having problems about people drinking their wine and getting drunk and stopping, and some people were starving and didn't get anything, that they had to take it away from the main meal. But I don't know whether it has to always be away from a meal. I think it can be part of, or sometimes it needn't be. But it's the meaning, it's what it means. Yeshua said it, this is my body broken for, oh, hallelujah. This is the new covenant. It's got so much meaning, hasn't it? And we've got to keep that meaning. And so, with these traditions, there was a tendency to move away from the old traditions and develop new ones. And sometimes those old traditions, the old covenant traditions we can call them perhaps, they were put on one side. And that was part of what I've called the move away from Scripture. Yeshua taught from the Old Covenant Scriptures. When Esther said the church did not have literature, I bristled. Of course they had literature. They had the Tanakh, they had the Torah, they had the law, they had the writings. Oh, they had wonderful literature. But I do know what she was saying. They didn't have the Christian literature that we have these days. I mean, how many books can you read about how to do this and how to do that? They didn't have that. But they had tradition. They had literature that they could build on. And just look at some of the early sermons. Look at Peter's sermon. Look at Stephen's sermon. What were they based on? They didn't have anything to base it on apart from what they had seen in Yeshua and going back to what had been prophesied in the Scriptures. And then, of course, very quickly, the apostles began to write letters. And these letters, they didn't just go to one place. Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians. But we know that by the year 96, which is about 60-odd years after Yeshua went, if we say that Yeshua was crucified in 33 AD, it's not that much, it's quite quickly that he was writing the letter to Corinthians, but we know that in Rome they had copies of that letter. And so the people, they weren't saying, oh, this letter's to us. We're going to... They said, oh, this letter's preaching truth. Let's share it with the Ephesians. Let's take it to the Thessalonians. Let's take it to the Romans. And these letters were being circulated throughout the Christian church. And then, of course, the Gospels were being written so that people knew what had happened when Yeshua was on the earth. And so these writings were beginning to be accepted. And we have here, that thing in the middle is a ruler. And the Greek for ruler is canon. Okay, have you heard the word canon? Okay. What happened was, of course, there were lots of things being written around these times. Lots of people were writing things about Yeshua. And it had to be decided which of these are really the word from Yahweh and which are just man's ideas. We heard last night, David Pawson was telling us about a Bible which is full of man's ideas. And sometimes we get mixed up. And so there were lots of letters being written and books being written that were not the word of Yahweh. And so they had to decide. And what happened is, over the years, the people, many of the apostles were still around, and the church, they began to accept certain writings, and they began to reject others. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 313 that they actually sat down and said, look, these are the ones we accept, these we do not accept, and that became known as the canon of New Testament scripture. Let's do the same thing with the Old Testament, of course, earlier on, but these were the writings that we now have in our Bible that are right back there. They were accepted. It wasn't so much that anybody stood up and said, we'll accept this, 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 and this, and we'll reject this, this, and this, and this. It was the church in general who began to accept certain ones. They read them and they thought, this is obviously the word of Yahweh. And some they were rejected by the church as a whole. And then the church got together and accepted and produced what is known as the canon. Of course, not everybody agreed. There was a chap called Marcion. He was a rich, he'd made lots of money in shipping. He came from the Black Sea, and he went to Rome, and there he was, he was converted. I don't know whether he was converted before he went to Rome or afterwards. He, having made his fortune, he gave a lot of money to the church in Rome. 4 years later, he was excommunicated and his money was returned. Why? Just one moment. It was the way that he interpreted the Old Testament. He concluded that the God of the Old Testament was an inferior God. He was a creator and judge distinct from the God of love, who was the father of Yeshua, the Messiah. He was a creator God, but he was ignorant because he had to ask Adam where he was. He contradicted himself, first forbidding Moses to make graven images and then ordering him to make the image of a serpent. And he commanded dreadful slaughters, even of women and children. His conclusion was,
these Jewish scriptures must be thrown out of the church.
And he presented that to the church in general, and the church in general threw him out. They did not accept it. So what did he do? Well, what does any good person that disagrees in a church do? Go and make their own church. And so while he was expelled from the main church, he, of course, created lots of others. And that has caused problems ever since. There was another person called Barnabas who wrote an epistle. You may have heard of the Epistle of Barnabas. And he again looked at the Old Testament and he said, well, this is really good, provided we don't take it literally. And he began to interpret the Old Covenant scriptures. For example, he said, when the Jews worshipped the golden calf, the covenant was broken and never restored. The Jews then listened to this is me, isn't it? It's not you. Yeah. The Jews then listened to a wicked angel who told them to interpret their scriptures literally. In fact, though, the whole Old Testament is an enormous Christian allegory. Examples. The prohibition against eating pork really means avoiding men who pray only when they are needy, for swines bellow only when they are hungry. The prohibition against eating rabbits, hyenas, and weasels really warns against deviant sexual sins from the nature of these animals. The law of kosher, eating only animals with cloven hooves that chew the cud, means associating only with people who... Excuse me one moment.
Meditate.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start that again. The law of kosher, eating only animals with cloven hooves that chew the cud, means associating only with people who meditate on the Lord and have one foot on earth and one in heaven. Well, okay. In some of our sermons today, we might not quite say those things, but we will take parts of the Old Testament and use them as allegories. But to just say the Old Testament is to be rejected in what it actually says, no. What did the church council say to Barnabas? Out. No, we're not going to accept that. And so it would seem that many of the churches, even if they weren't accepted by the main church, there was this general movement away from the Old Covenant scriptures, from what they would call Jewish tradition, but we might call Yahweh's tradition, which doesn't mean it's bad. And there are a number of the church fathers warn against Judaism, and there were certainly, Justin Martyr wrote a great book arguing with Trypho the Jew, wasn't it? It's a good book, and obviously there was comparisons between Jew and Christian, but they never really got, shall we say, anti-Semitic until things moved on. In 167, that is, about 130 years after Yeshua, that is the earliest known declaration of Jewish deicide. You know what deicide means? It means God killers. In other words, the Jews were accused of having killed Yeshua, and therefore killed God. And this antagonism towards Judaism in many places has grown and grown and grown. And there were times, and there have been times, when the church has become totally anti-Semitic against the Jews. Okay, we may not see where the church is working in some of these things, but believe me, it is. We have the Crusades. In the year 1096, many of the leaders in Europe decided that they were going to go take their armies and go to Jerusalem and deliver Jerusalem from the Muslims. Okay, Jerusalem was in the hands of the Muslims at this time, and so many of the leaders, they got together their little armies, and they marched across Europe to Jerusalem. You know what happened on that march? If they came across a village where there were Jews, they would massacre them. This is the first time they were called pogroms, I think, even back there. Because in the Christian thinking of that time, the Jews were the ones that killed God. They killed Yeshua, and therefore we hate them. And so there was this total anti-Semitism across Europe. In 1290, all Jews were expelled from England. I think Nathan told us that. In 1391, Jews in Spain were massacred and eventually expelled in 1492. My history, which isn't much, but stuck in my head, is 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yes. 1492, the greatest thing that happened in 1492 was that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Where did he go? Around the world or to America? I can't remember. He discovered America, didn't he? And that's the thing that's uppermost in people's minds. But in Spain, the Jews were expelled from that country in 1492. And then there's so many times when the Jews have been accused, just like Nero, who wanted to accuse somebody and so took the Jews. The Cossacks in the Ukraine, they had pogroms, in the film Fiddler on the Roof. That's one of the things that's happening there, isn't it? And that was reality. That really happened. And of course, the final thing that we all know about is the Holocaust of the 30s and 40s. So there have been times when it seems that the church has just risen up against the Jews and accused them. But who killed Yeshua? Wasn't the Romans, wasn't the Jews. It was me and my sin. Is that right? We cannot accuse anybody of doing that. And we come up to the Reformation. And of course, Martin Luther, wonderful man, who brought in the idea of salvation through grace alone. Isn't that wonderful? He did a wonderful job of moving the church away from Catholicism and things like that, and bringing truth into the church. This is what he wrote just before he died. He wrote 2 books. One of them was called On the Jews and Their Lies, and this is what he said.
A base, whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, circumcision, and law must be accounted as filth. He also said, they are full of the devil's feces, which they wallow in like swine, and the synagogue is an incorrigible whore and an evil slut.
How could somebody who was so used by Yahweh have that blockage in his mind? Because I'm sure that's what it was. And yet, just briefly looking at history of the church, get David Pawson's book, by the way, I'm sure it'll be good, on this history of the church. And throughout, we find people who saw truth and promoted truth, and yet in other areas, they did not see it. And this is our human mind, and I think we have to be careful of this, not to just reject something because we can't see it, but pray about it, talk about it, discuss with it. As I said last night, one thing that we're good at is disagreeing nicely. I'm not saying that we disagree all the time, but sometimes we do. And sometimes we have to agree to disagree. Not in basics of salvation and so forth, but sometimes we can get so hung up on the little things that we forget the big things. We mustn't do that. And I'm sorry, we're really, after what I heard last night, we're really having a go at Schofield. I got a Schofield Bible, and I used to love the Schofield notes, and I'm not saying they're all wrong, but Schofield, not only did he bring in that that David Pawson talked about last night, the pre-rapture, the pre-tribulation rapture, or whatever you want to call it, but he also brought in another idea, and that is that the church has replaced the Jewish people. That was another idea that he brought in. And you can see where he gets it. You can see where it all comes from. But it just, if you take it too far, it just becomes anti-Semitism. So we have to be careful. And that is something that has happened in the church that we must be really sure we don't get involved in. Doctrines and denominations. Doctrines are useful. Without doctrines, we wouldn't know what was truth and what was a lie, would we? We need, and from the early church, there was a need to define doctrines, to explain what we believe. And of course, the Greek people, the intelligent, the Greek people, the philosophers, they wanted everything explained. And so the early church people, Paul and Barnabas, they really they began to try to explain. But occasionally things came up that weren't accepted generally. For example, as we heard, these people that came down to the church and said that you need to be circumcised. And Paul and Barnabas, they said, we don't believe that. But what did they do? They went off to Jerusalem and they had a council. And that was in the year 50. That's the first one there. They had a council together and they talked together and they decided, this is what we're going to say to the church. And they sent people back with the necessary letters to say what they had decided. And over the years, these councils were convened every so often when things had to be sorted out, as they do. We've got, the Council of Carthage in 251, the Council of Antioch, the Council of Ankara, and the Council of Nicaea. Out of all those, you probably may have heard of the Council of Nicaea. It tends to be the one that's brought up, but every so often they would have to get together and decide, what do we really believe? What is truth? We've got the scriptures, we've got the writings of Paul, we've got the Gospels, but isn't it strange how I can think it means one thing and you can think it means something else? And so again, this dialogue, this working together, so necessary. One of the things that when Constantine became a Christian, he got a bit upset because the Christians were arguing against themselves. Some were saying that Yeshua existed from the beginning, and some were saying that Yeshua was born in Bethlehem and didn't exist before that. Some were saying that Yeshua was deity, was God, and some were saying no, he wasn't. All these ideas were being argued about between Yahweh and his son Yeshua. There was one famous chap called Arius who said that the only unbegotten being was the Father. So no other creature was like him. Yeshua the Son was begotten. So Arius maintained that the Son was created. If he was created, then there was a time when he didn't exist. You all understood that, didn't you? But, and the majority of us, we don't really want to get involved in these sort of arguments. But of course it is important that the church knows what it's talking about and knows what it was believed. And so Constantine said to the church leaders, he said, get together, come to Nicaea, and get together and sort it out. And so they did. How many bishops was it? 220 bishops and a lot of other people came together at Nicaea, and they talked about, and Arius was able to present his ideas, and eventually Arius, they said to Arius that we don't agree with you. They sent Arius on his way, excommunicated him, I think, from the church. So what did he do? He went down to Alexandria and he started his own church. And so we get these different ideas. The church actually said, no, we do not agree with you, Arius. We think that Yeshua always existed. And they put together a statement of what they believed called the Trinity, which has caused problems in the church ever since. But they did their best to explain something that, in my mind, is inexplicable. But they did their best to put it together, and they wrote it down. And even today, we're still arguing about that. But how important is it? Maybe it's important, and maybe we need to sort it out. But of course, this happened down the years. People, they disagreed, they had different thoughts, they went off, they created their own churches. And so we get denominations. Going back to Rome and the time of Constantine, when he made Christianity the official religion, as I said earlier on, most people were pagan worshippers, worshipped lots of different gods. And of course, so was Constantine. And of course, when they converted to Christianity, it wasn't always plain sailing. Sometimes they brought over some of the thinking that they had had when they were pagans. Constantine was originally a sun worshipper, and although he converted to Christianity, some of the things that he had previously believed came over with him. We know that by the time he died, he was still had on the back of his coins, that's Constantine on the front, on the back of his coins is Sol Invictus, which is the what does it mean? Unconquerable sun, thank you. The unconquerable sun. And okay, in his thinking, there might have been some of that old paganism left, but when he died, I'd like to know, did he know Yeshua as his Saviour? Is that the important thing? I hope Constantine's. He's been blamed for a lot of things, but I think a lot of the things that happened and came about would have happened whether Constantine had been around or not, and I think he did some very good things. By that time, the church were arguing over Easter. When do we celebrate Easter? Half the church was celebrating Easter at Passover, obviously, and half the church was celebrating Easter at a different time because they had a different calendar. And again, that's still an argument in the church, isn't it? So, and as Nathan was telling us, even in the Celtic church, when Augustine came over, it was still being argued over. Oh, you can really, if you like arguments, become a Christian. The church began as a community of people living life centered on Yeshua and his teachings. And Yeshua's teachings and his life were centered on the work of Yahweh with his people from the beginning. Is that not true? Yeshua continued the work that had been started with Adam and Moses and Abraham. Came through, Yeshua continued that work, taught those teachings to his people. The church lived their life according to his teachings. Today, the focus of the church, maybe for some, they focus on the building, maybe the tradition, maybe the rituals, maybe the music, maybe the signs and wonders, maybe predicting the future. The church can focus on so many different things, and none of those are wrong, provided Yeshua is the center of our worship, of our adoration, of our love. If tradition helps me to remember and celebrate the great things Yahweh has done, good for tradition. We keep it. If the great buildings help me to appreciate the greatness of Yahweh, is that wrong? If our music helps me draw closer to Yahweh, is that good? Of course it's good. If the signs and wonders that are performed by great men glorify Yahweh and not the great men, of course it's good. If I predict the future and that is based on what Yahweh wants me to know about it, hallelujah. But if it's man's idea, we don't want it. So, if Yeshua is the center, he has to be. And so the question I've got to leave you with is, what sort of people does he want us to be? What sort of church does he want us to be? When we meet together, are we being his church? We need to evaluate what we do and not simply do it because it's always been done. Yesterday, today, forever. Yeshua never changes. So we've still got to use the King James Bible. It's a sort of argument that sometimes they're given. It takes a brave church to do what Yahweh wants them to do, because so many people don't like change. Is that true? And the other half always want to change. So where are we going? We have to make sure that we are centered on our worship, that Yeshua is the center of our worship, and we do what he wants us to do in our community now.